hand let go and had a knife. So why were there other voices?
The rope jerked hard, and then I heard fibers tearing above me. Please, Ethan, stop. I was hanging halfway down a jagged cliff, my fingers burning against the rock, my harness the only thing keeping me alive. My brother stood at the top, holding my rope close enough to save me without even trying. But he didn't pull me up. He looked down at me, calm, almost annoyed. Just let go, he said. Not panicked, not scared, like he'd already decided. I froze not from fear of falling, but from realizing something was completely wrong. Ethan wasn't slipping. He wasn't losing grip. He was choosing this. Then, footsteps. Voices somewhere above him. Someone else was there? Ethan's head snapped toward the sound, and the rope suddenly went slack in his hands. And that's when it started to snap. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. I remember thinking, with this weird, horrible clarity, that none of this made sense. Not the way he was standing, not the way he was looking at me, not the words he'd used. People panic on cliffs, they shout, they curse, they drop things, they make mistakes. They do not stare down at their sister like they're waiting for a problem to solve itself. Ethan! I yelled again, trying to get one boot against the rock. Pebbles kicked loose beneath me and rattled down into the canyon. Anchor it! Just lock it off! His face barely changed. Wind pushed at his jacket. Behind him, the sky looked white and empty, too bright to stare at, and all I could see was his outline over the edge and that rope running through his hands. Then he said it again, quieter this time. Just let go, Tara. That was the moment the fear changed shape. Up until then, I thought I was dealing with a climbing mistake. Maybe he'd set something wrong. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Maybe he had no idea what he was doing and was freezing at the worst possible second. But that sentence didn't come from panic. It came from somewhere colder. My right shoulder was already throbbing from where I'd slammed into the rock a few seconds earlier. The harness cut so hard into my ribs that every breath felt shallow. I tried to shift my weight, tried to find a foothold on the narrow face beneath me, but the wall was too sheer there, the stone too loose. I could keep myself from spinning. That was about it. Above me, Ethan crouched and touched the rope near the edge. Don't, I said, and my voice came out lower than I expected, more controlled, more frightened because of that. Don't touch it. For a second, I could hear nothing but wind. Then those footsteps again. Not close. Maybe 10 yards back from the ledge. Gravel crunching. A voice I couldn't make out. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, and in that tiny movement, with his attention broken for just half a second, something flashed in my head so fast, it almost didn't feel like a thought at all. This trip. His idea. His route. His gear check. His insistence that he wanted to do this right because he was tired of me treating him like he couldn't handle anything serious. I'd almost laughed when he said that 2 mornings earlier in the motel parking lot while we were unloading the car, not because it was funny, but because it sounded so rehearsed. Ethan had never cared about doing anything right before. He cared about sounding convincing after doing it wrong. And still, I came. That part kept hitting me even while I hung there. I came because he called me 6 weeks earlier out of nowhere, after almost a year of silence, and said he missed me. Because he said he was tired of everyone in the family acting like the only things left between us were old fights and worse memories. Because he sounded different, softer, embarrassed, even. He said he knew he'd screwed up more times than he could count. He said he was trying to fix things. And for a while, I believed him. I should explain this much. Ethan was my older brother, but somehow I'd spent most of my life feeling older than he was. When we were kids, he was the one breaking windows, starting fights, losing jobs, before he was even old enough to call them jobs. By the time we were adults, the pattern had just gotten more expensive. Late rent, maxed out credit cards, stories that changed every time you asked a second question. I was always the one getting called after. Not because I wanted that role, because no one else could handle it. And Ethan hated me for that almost as much as he depended on it. He hated that our parents trusted me with practical things, hated that I was the one mom called when paperwork showed up, hated that when dad had surgery last year, I was the one who handled his insurance mess because Ethan couldn't miss work, even though he wasn't really working then either. He never said it directly. Ethan almost never said the ugliest thing directly. He just smiled when people praised me. He made jokes, he rolled his eyes, he found ways to make responsibility sound arrogant. You always need to be the competent one, he'd told me the night before the climb while we sat outside the motel with takeout containers balanced on our knees. You ever think maybe people only trust you because you like being the one in charge? I remembered looking at him under that buzzing yellow light and saying, or maybe they trust me because I don't disappear when things get hard. He'd smiled at that. Not angry, just thin. That sounds like something you practiced in the mirror. At the time, it felt like Ethan being Ethan, a cheap shot, a familiar old bitterness. I should have let it land harder than I did. Because the truth was, there had been other things, little things. The way he insisted on choosing a more isolated climbing route than the one I suggested. The way he kept asking weird questions during the drive, whether I still had the life insurance policy through work, whether I'd ever updated my emergency contact, whether I'd finally gotten around to making a will after Dad's health scare. He'd laughed after every question, like he was mocking how organized I was. But he watched my face too closely each time. Even this morning, standing at the trailhead with the sun barely up and the rocks still cold, he'd checked my harness twice when I didn't ask him to. "You trust me, right?" he said. I was tightening a glove when he asked it. I looked up, and he was smiling. I remember smiling back, distracted, with the not, "No, that's why I'm checking it myself." He laughed, but something in his expression hardened for half a second before it vanished. Now, hanging under that cliff, I saw all of it at once, like separate pieces suddenly locking together. Above me, the voices got clearer, not close enough to help, just close enough that Ethan heard them too. He leaned farther over the edge, and for the first time, I saw what was in his hand. A knife. Not big. Folding blade, dark handle. One I'd seen him use earlier that morning to cut tape off a bundle of gear in the parking lot. My whole body went cold. "Ethan," I said, and this time I wasn't asking. "No." He looked at me. No anger, no rush, just that same flat, settled expression, like he'd already crossed whatever line mattered and there was no reason to pretend anymore. Then the final strands gave way. The rope snapped. And as I dropped, I heard someone above us shout, "Hey, what are you doing?" The officer didn't wait for Ethan to invite him in. He stepped forward the second the door opened, his eyes already scanning past Ethan into the house, like he expected something or someone inside. "Ethan Cole?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Ethan nodded too quickly. "Yeah, what's this about?" "Your sister, Tara." The name hit the air and just stayed there. For a split second, Ethan didn't react at all. Then his shoulders tightened and he stepped back, letting them in without another word. From the outside, it might have looked like shock. Up close, it didn't. It looked like someone who'd been waiting. 3 days earlier, at the base of the canyon, the world had gone silent the second the rope snapped. No scream. No impact echo that made sense of what just happened. Just whined. And then nothing. "Why don't we sit down?" the second officer said, already moving toward the small kitchen table like he'd done this before 100 times. Ethan followed, slower. His hands hovered awkwardly near the back of a chair before he finally sat. "Tell us about the last time you saw your sister," the first officer said. Ethan swallowed. "We were climbing. It was an accident." He said it fast. Too fast. The officer didn't interrupt. He just watched him. Ethan pressed on. The rope, it must have slipped. Or snapped. I tried to. He stopped, like he couldn't find the right version of the story quickly enough. I tried to hold it. There was a long pause. The second officer reached into a folder and slid something across the table. A photo. Ethan didn't touch it at first. He just stared. "Go ahead," the officer said. Slowly, Ethan pulled it closer. It was a close-up of the rope from the cliff. The end wasn't frayed the way it should have been if it snapped under tension. It was clean. Too clean. Like it had been cut. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the photo. That's not ropes can tear like that, under stress. The officer's expression didn't change. Not like this. The morning of the climb replayed itself in fragments that now felt wrong in ways Tara hadn't fully processed at the time. Ethan had woken up before her. That alone was unusual. When she stepped out of the motel bathroom, still tying her hair back, he was already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone. "You're up early," she said. He glanced up. Couldn't sleep. There was something off about the way he said it. Not tired, not groggy, alert, focused. On the drive out, he barely played music. That was another thing. Ethan hated silence. He usually filled it with whatever he could. Songs, podcasts, random commentary. But that morning, he kept glancing at her instead. "So," he said at one point, tapping the steering wheel, "you ever think about what happens if something goes wrong out here?" Tara frowned. "You mean like injuries? That's why we plan." "No, I mean really wrong," he said. "Like, no one around, no signal, just," he made a vague motion toward the mountains. "Nothing." She gave him a look. "Then we rely on training. That's literally the point of doing this safely." He nodded, like he agreed. But he didn't smile. Back in the present, Ethan pushed the photo away like it might burn him. "I didn't cut anything," he said, quieter now. "I dropped my knife earlier. It must have someone else could have." "Someone else?" the officer repeated. Ethan hesitated. The words he'd just said didn't even sound solid to him. "There were people," he said, grasping for it. "Near the top. I heard voices." The two officers exchanged a quick look. "Interesting," one of them said. He reached into the folder again. This time, he pulled out another image and placed it carefully on top of the first. "A hiker was on the ridge above you," he said. "Not close, but close enough to hear voices." Ethan didn't move. "They reported something," the officer continued, a man shouting down and a woman responding. Ethan's throat tightened. "That doesn't mean anything." "No," the officer said calmly, "not by itself." He leaned forward slightly. "But it does get more specific." Ethan finally looked up, and the officer held his gaze, as he said, "They heard you tell her to let go." Silence swallowed the room. Ethan's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The second officer slid a third item onto the table. Not a photo this time. A clear evidence bag. Inside it, Ethan's knife. Dark handle. Folded blade. A faint smear along the edge. "We found this about 6 feet from the anchor point," the officer said, with fibers on it that matched the rope. Ethan stared at it like he didn't recognize it. Like if he looked long enough, it might become something else. "That doesn't prove anything," he said, but his voice had lost its structure now. "I told you I dropped it earlier. I didn't even realize." "You didn't realize your knife was missing?" the officer cut in. "But you're certain you never touched the rope with it?" Ethan didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer that worked anymore. The officer leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to settle. Then he said, almost casually, "There's something else you should know." Ethan's eyes flicked up again. And the officer tapped the photo of the rope. "We had it analyzed," he said, "and the cut wasn't made in a panic. A beat. It was clean, controlled." He paused, just long enough, deliberate. Ethan's hands started to shake. And for the first time since they walked in, he looked like he might actually fall apart. But not because they were accusing him, because they were getting closer than he expected. And he wasn't ready for what came next. "Because that rope," the officer said quietly, "it wasn't the only thing that was tampered with." Ethan's head snapped up. "What do you mean, not the only thing?" The officer didn't answer right away. He let the question hang, watching the way Ethan's breathing started to shorten, the way his fingers curled tighter against the edge of the table like he needed something solid to hold on to. Then he slid another photo forward. This one wasn't of the rope. It was the top of the cliff, the anchor point. Metal hardware bolted into rock, a section of rope threaded through it, except something about it looked off. "We had a climbing specialist look at your setup," the officer said. "Someone who's been doing this longer than you and your sister combined." Ethan's eyes flicked between the photo and the officer. "Okay, and?" "And they noticed something interesting." The officer tapped the image. "This anchor wasn't secure." Ethan frowned immediately, shaking his head. "That's not no. I set that up exactly how she told me to." "Did you?" the second officer asked. Ethan hesitated, just a fraction too long. Hours earlier, before the fall, the morning had felt almost normal. Cold air, quiet trail, the kind of stillness that made every sound sharper. Tara had been a few steps ahead, scanning the rock face, already mapping the climb in her head. Ethan followed behind, carrying more gear than necessary, something he insisted on, even when she told him to pack lighter. "You don't need half of that," she said without turning around. "Yeah, well," he replied, adjusting the straps. "Maybe I like being prepared for once." She glanced back at him then. "Prepared or paranoid?" He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Same thing out here, isn't it?" Back in the present, the officer leaned forward slightly. The anchor point, he said, was intentionally weakened. Ethan blinked. That doesn't make any sense. It does if someone planned for the system to fail, the officer replied. That's not why would I? Ethan cut himself off, the sentence collapsing before it could finish. Because there wasn't a version of that question that didn't point directly back at him. At the base of the climb, Tara had done what she always did, checked everything. Her harness, the knots, the rope threading. And then she checked Ethan's work. Walk me through what you did here, she said, crouching near the anchor. Ethan stood behind her, hands in his pockets. Same setup you showed me last time. She nodded slowly, eyes narrowing just a bit as she traced the rope with her fingers. It held. Everything looked right. But something about the tension felt uneven. She tugged once, testing it. Feels fine, Ethan said quickly. Tara glanced back at him. I didn't say it didn't. A beat? Then she stood, brushing dust off her hands. I'll go first. Of course you will, Ethan muttered. She didn't respond to that. The officer opened a folder and pulled out a printed report, setting it beside the photo. There were micro-cuts along one section of the rope near the anchor, he said, small enough that they wouldn't be obvious during a standard check. Ethan's stomach dropped. They weakened the structure, the officer continued. Not enough to fail immediately, just enough that under sustained weight. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ethan's voice came out barely above a whisper. I didn't do that. But it sounded thinner now, less certain. Halfway up the cliff, Tara had paused. Not because she was tired, because something didn't feel right. She shifted her weight, testing the rope tension again. There it was. A slight give. Too much give. Ethan, she called up, keeping her tone even. You anchored this through the primary bolt, right? Yeah, he called back. Exactly how you said. She frowned, looking up. His silhouette was just visible against the sky. Say it again, she said. Walk me through it. There was a pause. Just long enough. Primary bolt, he repeated, then looped and secured. It sounded correct. But it didn't feel correct. Back in the kitchen, the officer watched Ethan closely. You had full control over the setup, he said. Your sister trusted you with it. Ethan let out a short, hollow laugh. No, she didn't. Not really. Then why insist on doing it yourself? Ethan didn't answer. Because the truth to that question wasn't something he could reshape on the fly. The officer slid one final image across the table. A wider shot of the cliff edge. 2 rope lines visible. One, the main line cut. The other, thinner. Subtler. Your sister clipped into a secondary safety line, the officer said. Ethan's head jerked up. What? It's something experienced climbers do when something feels off, he continued. A backup. Ethan stared at the photo, his mind trying to process it and failing. Because that hadn't been part of the plan. You didn't know about that, did you? The officer asked quietly. Ethan's silence answered for him. The room seemed to shrink. Every piece of control he thought he had was slipping. And then the officer said the one thing that shattered whatever was left. We also found signs that she survived the initial fall. Ethan's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up. No, he said immediately. No, that's not she would have. There's no way. His voice cracked. Not with grief. With panic. Because if Tara was alive, then everything he said, everything he did, was about to come back on him. The officer didn't move. He just watched Ethan carefully and said, We haven't recovered her yet. A beat, but we're getting closer. And for the first time since the rope snapped, Ethan looked like he wished it hadn't. Ethan didn't sit back down. He just stood there, one hand gripping the back of the chair so tightly his knuckles went pale, eyes fixed on the officer like he was waiting for him to take it back. Getting closer? How? He asked, his voice uneven now. You said you haven't found her. We said we haven't recovered her, the officer corrected calmly. That's not the same thing. The distinction landed hard. Because Ethan understood exactly what it meant. Down in the canyon, after the rope gave way, the fall hadn't been clean. It had been violent. Tara dropped fast, too fast to think, too fast to react until the secondary line snapped taut. The force slammed her sideways into the rock. hard enough to knock the air out of her lungs, hard enough to send a burst of white across her vision. For a few seconds, she couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Just hung there, suspended again, but lower now, deeper into the canyon where the light barely reached. When her lungs finally dragged in air, it came sharp and broken. She didn't scream. She listened. Above her, voices echoed faintly. One of them was Ethan's. Didn't mean, his voice carried, distorted by distance and wind. Another voice stranger, sharper, cut in. What the hell was that? Tara's fingers tightened weakly around the rope. He hadn't expected anyone else to be there. Back in the kitchen, the officer slid a map onto the table, flattening it with his palm. A marked search grid spread across the canyon. We picked up a weak signal from a personal locator beacon yesterday morning, he said. It didn't transmit long, but it was enough. Ethan stared at the map like it was written in another language. That doesn't prove it was her. It was registered to her climbing gear, the officer replied. That landed heavier than anything else so far. Because it meant she hadn't just survived the fall. She'd stayed alive long enough to try and be found. The first night in the canyon had been the worst. Tara knew that almost immediately. Her shoulder wasn't just bruised, it was partially dislocated. Every movement sent a sharp, grinding pain through her arm. Her leg wasn't much better, she couldn't put full weight on it without it buckling. And the rope above her, the backup was holding, but it wasn't meant for long-term suspension. She had to move. Carefully, slowly, she shifted her weight, inching herself toward a narrow ledge a few feet to her right. Every movement was deliberate. Every breath measured. She didn't rush. Because rushing was how people died in places like this. When she finally pulled herself onto the ledge, collapsing against the cold rock, she closed her eyes for just a second. And in that silence, one thought kept repeating. He told me to let go. Not shouted, not panicked, told. You never called for help, the officer said, pulling Ethan back into the present. Not after the fall. Ethan blinked. I didn't have signal. You drove 20 miles before trying, the second officer added. I was in shock, Ethan snapped, too quickly. I wasn't thinking straight. The officer tilted his head slightly. That's interesting. Ethan's chest tightened. Why? Because witnesses say you were thinking very clearly. The hiker on the ridge had a partial view. Not enough to see the cut itself, but enough to see Ethan's posture. Steady. Controlled. Not someone scrambling to save a falling climber. Someone standing still, watching. And after the rope snapped, walking away from the edge. You left, the officer said simply. Ethan shook his head immediately. No, I went to get help. You packed your gear first, the officer replied. Took the time to clear the area. That's not... You wiped down the anchor hardware. That stopped him. Completely. Because that wasn't something you could explain away as panic. On the second day, the canyon heat had set in. Tara rationed what little water she had left, using small sips to keep herself functional. Her hands were torn. Her muscles screamed every time she shifted. But she kept moving. Not up. Not yet. Across, searching for a path. A way out that didn't rely on the rope Ethan had already proven he was willing to destroy. At one point, she found a small overhang, just enough shade to keep from overheating. She stayed there for hours, listening, waiting, thinking, replaying every second of that moment at the top of the cliff. Every word, every look, every hesitation, until there was no version of it left that looked like an accident. Back in the kitchen, Ethan's voice dropped. What happens if you find her? The officer didn't hesitate. Then she tells us exactly what happened. A beat. And we compare it to what you've been telling us. Ethan swallowed hard. Because the gap between those two versions was about to become impossible to hide. The officer gathered the photos slowly, stacking them into a neat pile. Then he paused, looking directly at Ethan. There's just one problem with your story, he said. Ethan didn't respond. Didn't move. Didn't breathe. And the officer finished, his voice quiet but absolute. Your sister didn't die that day. The words hung in the air. And somewhere far below that cliff, Tara was still alive. 3 days in the canyon changes the way time feels. For Tara, it stopped being hours sometime during the second night. It became movements, decisions, breaths. Stay conscious. Stay anchored. Stay alive. By the morning of the third day, her body had adapted to the pain in the only way it could, by dulling it into something constant and manageable. Her shoulders still burned with every shift. Her legs still threatened to give out if she misstepped. But she wasn't thinking about the fall anymore. She was thinking about the climb out. Not up the original route that was gone. The main rope had fallen with the cut, useless, somewhere below. The backup line had saved her life, but it wasn't anchored in a way she trusted for ascent. So she moved laterally, slow, careful, testing every hold before committing weight. At one point, her hands slipped on loose grit and her entire body lurched sideways. The sudden drop in her stomach, the instinctive grasp for anything solid, it all came back in a flash. The moment the rope snapped, Ethan's face above her. Just let go. Her jaw tightened. She didn't stop moving. The signal she triggered had been a last resort. A small device clipped inside her pack, one she always carried, even on safe climbs. She'd hesitated before activating it, not because she didn't need help, because she understood what it meant. Once that signal went out, this wasn't just a rescue. It was an investigation. Still, she pressed it. And waited. By the time the search team found her, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no sudden rush. Just a voice, steady and controlled, echoing across the rock. "Climbers, stay where you are, we see you." Tara didn't answer right away. She was sitting under the overhang she'd found the day before, back pressed against the stone, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry but clear. "I'm here." Boots scraped against rock as two rescuers approached carefully, securing their own lines as they moved toward her. One of them crouched a few feet away, assessing quickly. "Injuries?" "Shoulder," she said. "Leg. I can move." The rescuer nodded. "You're lucky." Tara's gaze lifted slightly. "No," she said after a moment. "I was careful." A beat passed. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "My brother cut the rope." The rescuer didn't react immediately, didn't question it. He just gave a small nod. "Okay," he said, "we'll get you out first. Then you can tell us everything." Back at the house, Ethan didn't last much longer after that. It wasn't one big confession. It was a series of small collapses. Contradictions stacking on contradictions. Explanations that unraveled the second they were questioned twice. "You said you didn't touch the rope." "I didn't like that. I mean, I was checking it." "With a knife?" "I told you. I dropped it." "After or before you told her to let go?" That question stayed in the air longer than the others. Because there wasn't a version of events where that sentence made sense. Not as an accident. Not as panic. Only as intent. When they brought Tara's statement into the room, everything shifted. Recorded. Clear. Detailed. She described the sequence without exaggeration. The hesitation in Ethan's responses, the unnatural calm in his voice, the repeated instruction to let go, the visible knife in his hand. She didn't guess. She didn't assume. She stated what she saw, and that made it harder to dismiss. Ethan's motive wasn't complicated. That was the part that landed hardest with everyone who heard it. Debt. Not small, manageable debt. The kind that followed him, pressed on him, closed options off, one by one. He knew Tara handled family finances. Knew she had savings, insurance, stability. He also knew something else, something he'd confirmed during those casual conversations on the drive. If something happened to her, he would be next in line to manage certain assets. Temporary control, enough access to solve immediate problems. He didn't need it to look perfect. He just needed it to look like an accident. A climbing failure in a remote area. No witnesses. No recovery. No questions. Except there were witnesses. And Tara didn't die. The legal process moved faster than anyone expected. Attempted murder, evidence tampering, filing a false report. Each charge built on the last, forming something that couldn't be brushed off or negotiated down to nothing. Ethan sat through it all quieter than usual. Not defiant. Not emotional. Just diminished. Like whatever calculation he made at the edge of that cliff had finally finished playing out, and this was the result. For Tara, recovery took longer. Physical therapy for her shoulder. Rebuilding strength in her leg. But the physical side wasn't the part that lingered. It was the memory of looking up and seeing him there. Not struggling, not trying, deciding. People asked her carefully if she hated him. She never answered that directly, because the feeling wasn't simple enough to fit that word. Months later, she went back. Same canyon, same trail. Not alone this time, but the final stretch to the overlook, she walked ahead. When she reached the edge, she stopped a few feet back. Didn't rush it, didn't look down immediately. Just stood there, letting the wind move past her the same way it had that day. When she finally stepped closer, the drop looked exactly the same. Sharp, unforgiving, silent. There was no visible mark of what happened. No sign that anything had gone wrong there at all. Tara folded her arms loosely, her shoulders still stiff but functional now, and looked over the edge. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly more to the space than to anyone else, she spoke. He told me to let go. The words didn't echo far. They didn't need to. She exhaled slowly, steady. But he was the one who lost everything. And this time, she stepped back on her own terms.
So, was this desperation or a plan? And what details did everyone miss?